A 36-year-old builder, dying of a heart attack, suddenly confessed to a journalist that he had accidentally killed Brian Jones, the founder of the Rolling Stones. That confession didn't just contradict the coroner's 1969 ruling of accidental drowning, it exposed a secret the man had carried in silence for 24 years. The question that remains is simple. Can a recorded deathbed confession really be enough to turn a musical tragedy into a covered-up killing? Every great rock story needs an origin point, and this one begins not with tragedy but with vision. Brian Jones founded the Rolling Stones in 1962, and it was Jones himself who named the band, borrowing the phrase from Muddy Waters' song Rollin' Stone. Long before anyone associated the Stones with Mick Jagger's swagger or Keith Richards' riffs, it was Jones who assembled the group and gave it its identity. He wasn't simply a founder in name only, either. He was, by nearly every account, the band's most versatile musician, capable of playing more than 20 different instruments, from guitar and harmonica to sitar, piano and marimba. On the 1967 album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request, Jones reportedly played at least 10 different instruments across the recordings, an extraordinary range that few rock musicians of that era could match. A musician capable of playing more than 20 instruments wasn't just a member of the band. He was in a very real sense the soul behind much of its signature sound. But brilliance inside a band doesn't guarantee loyalty, and by 1966 cracks were already forming. By the time the band began recording Let It Bleed, Jones's presence had shrunk dramatically. He ended up contributing to just 2 tracks on the entire album, a direct casualty of relationships that had grown increasingly bitter. Adding fuel to the fire, Jones had also signed a personal publishing deal with Kit Lambert, the manager of The Who, a move that some inside the band's circle viewed as an outright betrayal, further poisoning what was left of the group's internal trust. Have you ever watched a friendship curdle simply because one person tried to build something separate for themselves? That's roughly what happened here, on a much more public stage. It turns out the brotherhood inside one of rock's most legendary bands was every bit as fragile as glass, shattering the moment one member was branded a traitor for seeking his own path. As the internal rifts widened, Jones's legal and physical troubles multiplied in parallel. Between 1967 and 1969, he was arrested multiple times for possession of marijuana, cocaine and methamphetamine, a string of legal troubles that steadily chipped away at both his reputation and his stability. At a trial in October 1967, he was sentenced to 9 months in prison for drug possession, though public outcry helped secure his release after just 4 months, a controversial outcome that only added to his growing notoriety. By early 1969, Jones had been diagnosed with a respiratory condition linked to allergies and severe stress, a clear signal that his health was deteriorating right alongside his standing in the band. Legal chaos and declining health had made his position within the Rolling Stones increasingly precarious, no longer an asset to the group, but, in the eyes of some, a liability they could no longer afford to carry. That precariousness reached its breaking point on June 8, 1969, when Jones was officially fired from the Rolling Stones, just 25 days before his death, and replaced by guitarist Mick Taylor. Rather than fight the decision, Jones seemed almost relieved. On July 2, 1969, he made the decision to retire quietly to Cotchford Farm, a property with an unusual literary history. It was once the home where author A. Milne had written the Winnie the Pooh stories. For a brief moment, it looked as though Jones had finally found somewhere peaceful to land, a quiet retreat far removed from the chaos of the band. But the timing could not have been crueler. Just as he seemed to have found peace in a place steeped in childhood nostalgia, tragedy was waiting to strike within days. The official story of what happened next is deceptively brief. On July 3, 1969, Brian Jones was found dead at the bottom of the swimming pool at his home in Cotchford Farm, East Sussex, at just 27 years old. At the coroner's inquest on July 8, 1969, the official cause of death was ruled accidental drowning, with the pathologist noting an enlarged liver and spleen consistent with drug and alcohol use. A 27-year-old star's death, wrapped up and sealed under the label of accident, remarkably fast, considering the pathologist never actually ran the deeper toxicology testing that a case this significant would normally demand. That's where Anna Wolin enters the story. Jones's girlfriend at the time of his death, Wolin has insisted for decades that he was murdered, describing a violent struggle with an attacker just before he drowned. According to timeline records, Jones was pronounced dead at 12:15 in the afternoon on July 3, roughly 3 hours after he was first discovered unresponsive, a gap that itself raises questions about how the scene was actually handled in those crucial early hours. Compounding the confusion, at least 3 different versions of where exactly Jones's body was located have circulated over the years: at the bottom of the pool, floating on the surface, or lying beside the pool entirely. A set of contradictions that undercuts confidence in any single official account. 3 competing versions of where the body was actually found, and not a single witness inside the house was ever formally interviewed by police. All of it stacked against a ruling that was reached remarkably fast. Boland didn't just speak up in passing interviews. In 1999, she published a book titled The Murder of Brian Jones, laying out her account in detail. According to her retelling, when she tried to call for a doctor that night, Frank Thorogood, a builder working at the property, physically forced her to the ground, while another man stood watch nearby. She has stated flatly that Jones did not die by accident, but was killed during a violent altercation. The account of the one witness who was actually present that night, insisting Jones had been murdered, was essentially ignored by the official process from the very start. And the gaps in the investigation don't end there. No blood test was ever performed on Jones's body. The only toxicology work conducted was a liver test, which detected alcohol and barbiturates. According to inquest records, not a single person who was inside the house at the time of the incident was ever interviewed by the police. Even Jones's signature on the document confirming his departure from the Rolling Stones, signed just 6 days before his death, was reportedly never independently verified by a lawyer, according to statements made later by his family. It was precisely these gaps in the official investigation that inadvertently allowed a far darker secret to stay buried for decades. Out of these gaps emerges a name that for years barely registered in the public retelling of this story: Frank Thorogood. A 36-year-old builder overseeing renovation work at Cotchford Farm, Thorogood reportedly got into an argument with Jones about the quality of his work on the very night Jones died. Remarkably, Thorogood's name appears in only a single Sussex police document from the entire investigation, despite the fact that he was, alongside Volan, one of the people who actually discovered the body. The man who found the body, the man who had argued with the victim only hours earlier, is almost entirely absent from the official record. What would actually drive a builder to violence against one of the most famous musicians in the world? According to journalist Terry Rawlings, the answer may be disappointingly mundane. Rawlings later recorded a confession from a man who admitted to accidentally killing Brian Jones during an argument over a construction bill, and that same man died shortly afterward. Money and unpaid work, 2 of the most ordinary pressures imaginable, and yet apparently enough to push someone to the edge. The strangeness surrounding Thorogood only deepens the more you look. Beyond his near-total absence from the official police file, there's a haunting coda to the story. When Jones's mother, Harriet, passed away in 1987, a handwritten letter was reportedly found among her belongings, accusing that her son's death had not been an accident at all, a discovery that reopened the family's long-standing suspicions all over again. The silence maintained by the authorities stands in stark contrast to the persistent doubts held by the people who loved Jones most, and Thorogood may not have been alone that night. At least one other figure, David Litvinoff, has surfaced in investigative documents connected to the case over the years, yet he has never been publicly questioned or fully accounted for, a gap that has quietly fueled its own undercurrent of conspiracy theories. Was there truly a third person involved in that fatal night, someone whose role in the story has simply never come to light? Eventually, the secret this particular builder carried would come out, not through investigation, but through the kind of overwhelming guilt that surfaces only when a person is finally facing death. It took nearly a quarter of a century for the truth, or something close to it, to finally surface. In 1993, 24 years after Brian Jones's death, an anonymous figure, later identified as Frank Thorogood, confessed to journalist Terry Rawlings that he had accidentally killed Jones shortly before dying himself of a heart attack. It apparently took facing his own mortality for Thorogood to finally find the courage to say what he had kept hidden for so long. The confession wasn't Rawlings's word alone. Janet Lawson, the nurse who cared for Thorogood during his final weeks, later confirmed to Rawlings that Thorogood had been terrified of taking the secret to his grave, and that he confessed openly to her as he lay dying. Corroboration from a nurse with no connection whatsoever to the band or its history lends a rare kind of credibility to a confession that might otherwise sound like tabloid fiction. According to Rawlings' own account, Thorogood told him plainly that he had never meant to kill Brian, a statement made in the final days of his life, in 1993, the same year he died of heart failure. Nurse Janet Lawson, who was with him during those last days, said he simply wanted to unburden himself before the end. That single admission wasn't just a confession of guilt. It reads in its own way as a final plea for forgiveness from a man who had run out of time to ask for it in any other way. Rawlings didn't rush to publish what he'd heard. He held on to the recorded material for nearly 20 years before finally releasing it publicly in his 2017 book, Death of a Rolling Stone. A truth kept locked away in a drawer for 2 full decades before it was finally handed over to the world. The family's reaction, once the confession became public, was immediate and consistent with everything they had long suspected. That handwritten letter, found among Harriet Jones's belongings after her 1987 death, had already reopened the family's questions years earlier. Then, in 2008, Sussex police formally reopened the investigation into Jones's death, following a formal complaint from a researcher who argued the original inquiry had been dangerously incomplete. And yet, even heartfelt pleas from a grieving family and persistent researchers proved insufficient to overturn a ruling that had already been sealed for decades. So what actually happened when police finally revisited this case? In 2008, Sussex police reopened the file on Jones's death after that researcher's complaint about the shoddiness of the original inquiry. The case was then handed over to Scotland Yard that same year, but the response was underwhelming. Officials stated there was no new information significant enough to change the original ruling. An investigation reopened with genuine hope, only to be quietly closed again almost immediately, with a declaration that nothing new had actually been found. There's another detail that has long troubled those following the case closely. In the aftermath of Jones's death, the band reportedly paid out the remainder of his rent and full settlement payments to his family within just a few weeks. A payment his family has since described as an attempt to buy silence rather than a simple act of generosity. A swift payout can look like compassion on the surface. It can just as easily look like an effort to end further questioning before it even began. Jones's death also sits inside a much larger, darker pattern that has fascinated researchers for decades. He died at 27, making him the first member of what would later be dubbed the 27 Club, a grim informal category eventually joined by Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison and Kurt Cobain. In an almost unbelievable coincidence, Jimi Hendrix died on September 18, 1970, and Janis Joplin followed on October 4 of that same year, both at the exact age Jones had been. That pattern would go on to become one of the most extensively studied phenomena in the entire history of rock culture. Jones, it turns out, was simply the man who opened the door to a tragic club that no musician would ever want to join. And there remains that lingering, unresolved thread from earlier in the story. David Litvinoff, the figure who appeared briefly in investigative documents but was never publicly interviewed or fully accounted for. Was there truly another person present that fatal night? Someone whose involvement has simply slipped through every crack in this decades-long investigation? If you wanted to genuinely evaluate a deathbed confession like this one for yourself, journalists and investigators tend to follow a fairly consistent method. First, verify the identity of the person confessing, their relationship to the victim, and their documented presence at the scene, recorded as early as possible. Second, cross-reference the confession against testimony from at least 3 independent witnesses, looking carefully for where accounts align and where they diverge. Third, compare everything against the official investigative record, the coroner's findings, inquest transcripts, and any surviving police reports. Fourth, seek out secondary verification wherever it exists. Investigative books, articles, and documentaries that approach the same event from different angles. And finally, insist on an original recording or written, signed testimony wherever possible, while openly acknowledging any limitations in how reliable that source actually is. More than half a century later, this case shows no sign of fading from public fascination. If anything, it keeps resurfacing in new forms. Anna Wolin's 1999 book, The Murder of Brian Jones, became something of a cultural event on its own, directly naming Thorogood as responsible for Jones's death. Wolin, Jones's Swedish girlfriend, would later claim she had been persuaded to alter parts of her original account, adding yet another layer of uncertainty to an already tangled story. A book written by the one woman actually present that night turned into a cultural phenomenon, dragging accusations against Thorogood squarely into public view. Cotchford Farm itself carries a strange duality that has only deepened public fascination with the case. The very house where Jones died was the same home where author A. Milne wrote the Winnie the Pooh stories back in the 1920s, and where his son Christopher Robin actually grew up. In 1969, the property sat on roughly 18 acres of land in the village of Hartfield, East Sussex, land that had once been part of Ashdown Forest, the real-world setting behind the fictional 100-acre wood. A place that once inspired beloved childhood stories became, decades later, the scene of a rock star's mysterious death, an irony that has never stopped fascinating writers and documentarians alike. Jones's death also arrived at an eerily symbolic moment in music history. He died just 169 days before the Altamont Free Concert on December 6, 1969, the infamous event that ended in the death of Meredith Hunter and is widely regarded as the moment the golden era of 1960s rock effectively came to a close. Jones's death almost seems, in hindsight, like the opening note in a chain of tragedies that quietly closed the door on rock's most idealistic decade. The story hasn't stopped generating fresh claims either. In the 2024 documentary The Death of Brian Jones, British private investigator Michael Gray claimed to have uncovered what he called undeniable evidence that Thorogood, rather than accident, was directly responsible for Jones's death. Produced by Vice Studios, the documentary drew a mixture of renewed public skepticism and support, reviving a controversy that has now persisted for 55 years. A dramatic claim of undeniable evidence delivered on camera in 2024, and still, after everything, nowhere close to a courtroom. Just 2 days after Brian Jones's death, the Rolling Stones went ahead with a free concert in Hyde Park, London on July 5, 1969, performing in front of roughly 250,000 people. The band didn't dedicate a single song to Jones's memory. Instead, Mick Jagger read aloud from Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem Adonai, written about the death of the poet Keats, before releasing thousands of white butterflies into the air above the crowd. Though many of the butterflies reportedly died almost immediately, overwhelmed by the heat and the stress of the release. Journalists at the time described it as a moment that was somehow both beautiful and unsettling all at once. A farewell performance in front of 250,000 people, framed by thousands of white butterflies, gorgeous and quietly haunting in equal measure. Jones's family, for their part, never accepted the official narrative. They have long believed his death was a killing rather than an accident, and they have never stopped pushing, in one form or another, for the truth to finally come out. Whatever the courts concluded, the people who loved him best simply never let the question go. And whatever the true circumstances of his death, Jones's musical legacy remains untouchable. As one of the era's most versatile instrumentalists, the founder who named the band and helped shape its earliest sound, his contribution to the Rolling Stones' identity is not something later controversies have managed to erase. Even in 2024, a 60th anniversary reissue of Let It Bleed reignited debate over whether Jones's contributions from that era were given their proper due, despite his diminished presence on the finished album. More than 55 years on, the question of what actually happened to Brian Jones remains unresolved, still echoing through the history of rock music. A builder's confession whispered on a deathbed. Is that really enough to rewrite history? The official verdict was accident, but the secret, it seems, is still sitting somewhere at the bottom of that pool at Cotchford Farm. What do you believe actually happened to Brian Jones?